right, guys, we can get started tonight. We are in Daniel chapter 6. It's been a song since we last had class. Feels like it's been 2 or 3 weeks. Last time we had class, we left off in like Daniel 6 verse 8 or so, but it's just 8 verses. So we're going to go back to verse 1 and just do a quick catch up. There's no sense in starting that close to the beginning and not just starting at the beginning. So I'm not going to recover all of the material that I have for the first 8 verses, but just to start at the top and then catch up to where we left off. So we're in Daniel chapter 6. Just go to verse number 1. We'll start there. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. Where we are right now follows chronologically right after chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, the Babylonian Empire was overthrown. The Medes and Persian Empire has taken over. And so you have now, a new sheriff in town. Darius is the ruler over the former Babylon. He is not the emperor of the Medes and Persian Empire. That would be Cyrus. He is simply the ruler over the territory where we've been for all of Daniel. Where we are in terms of the outline of the book, I did this before class started. If you remember, if you've been in the class before, we have the tiers, tier system, where the outer ring here, chapter 1 and also chapter 9 through 12, the beginning and the end of the book cover the same idea, which is God rebukes and restores. At least that's the way I wrote it here. God makes references to, or the chapters are about, going into captivity and coming out of captivity. And then the inner ring, chapter 2, but also chapter 7 and 8, cover the same material, which is God is setting up, prophesying to set up a kingdom that will be greater than all kingdoms of the world, that of course being the Church of Jesus Christ. Then in chapter 3 and chapter 6, where we are now, same theme in those 2 chapters, which is God rescues, God takes care of, God delivers His people while they're in exile. And then finally the bullseye, the core, what the whole book is really about, the thesis, chapters 4 and 5, God rules in the kingdoms of men. And that really explains everything that follows, and each one leads into the other. It's so beautifully interconnected, even though chronologically it doesn't work. I mean, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's in order. But it's really, by theme, chapter 1, 9, 10, 11, 12, 2, 7, 8, 3, 6, 4, 5. It doesn't have any kind of rhyme or reason when you think of it in terms of the themes. But when you see the way it's laid out and the way each one feeds into the other, it's a perfect little Matryoshka doll. It's a little Russian nesting doll. Dolls within dolls, that it perfectly fits what Daniel is really trying to convey, which again is the theme. God is the one in control of the kingdoms of men. All right, so that's where we are. We just read Daniel chapter 6, verse 1, which is just housekeeping. Darius is in charge by the emperor, and now he is appointing his own rulers, because if there's one thing a ruler loves to do, it is delegate so he doesn't have to do anything. So Cyrus is in power, but he is delegated to Darius, who is now delegating to 3. And they will, of course, if they want to, delegate and delegate and delegate. It's just delegations all the way down. Verse 2. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was the first, the King James says, let's translate that, the primary, the top banana, the most important, maybe not by rank, but by prestige, by favor of the king, and so forth. That the princes might give account unto them, and the king should have no damage. So you have, under these 3, various other regional and magistrate jurisdiction people who all report to them, who report to him, who ultimately has to report to the emperor. So again, verse 2, you have 3 of whom Daniel is primary, and they have to give account so that the king should receive no damage. Well, who would the king receive damage from but the emperor at the top of the chain? 3. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes. So that's what we were saying before. Because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. So, because Daniel, we're going to say he's here in the middle, because Daniel was considered by Darius head and shoulders above the others, because he was regarded as a man of upstanding character, because he was a person who not just, showed up on time and didn't complain and paid his taxes, but he was a person who seemed to have the character that, as you see, he thought, I might want to restructure the way we govern the entire kingdom and have it something more like this. You've got the emperor, he's appointed me, and I'll have Daniel and a couple of guys under him and rulers under them. Because I trust Daniel to take care of these guys, whereas right now they have equal footing. And sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes one rises above the others, and you want to give him the extra authority to make sure the boat stays afloat. So again, verse 3. He was preferred above the others because an excellent spirit, a good attitude, a strong spiritual character was in him, to the point where the king thought, I could set him over the whole realm, and I could just sit back in my easy chair and not do anything. Verse 4. Again, we're just rushing to catch up to where we left off last time. Verse 4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no occasion or fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. So, the idea is Daniel is so much greater. He's just a model, ideal citizen. So their first thought is these jealous and not just vindictive and petty, but in terms of like your typical politician, worried about their spot and looking to tear down someone to elevate themselves. They're thinking, well, right now he's viewed as this upstanding citizen. What do we have on him? Does anybody know if he's ever broken the speed limit? Does he not wear a seatbelt? Does he jaywalk? Does he kick old ladies? There's got to be something he does. It's against the law, and they could find nothing against the law. He was just faithful in all accounts. No error or fault found in him. Verse 5. So they, conspiring, said, we are not going to find any occasion against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. And what that doesn't mean is he's never going to break the laws of men, but maybe we can find him breaking the law of God. No, that's not it. It's the exact opposite. It's because he is so faithful, they're thinking, surely there is some law on the books that is against the law of God, that this guy who is so obviously faithful to his God would have to side with his God over the laws of men. So that's the way we're going to get him. That's the angle we're going to take. We're going to find some opportunity to entrap him and to convict him of being too faithful to God versus men. And they saw that in Daniel just as a hypothetical. You see what I mean? There was no law yet. They're going to have to try to finagle and wine and dine and schmooze the king into passing a law like that, because there isn't one yet. So they're operating just on the assumption that Daniel has shown himself to be such a man of high spiritual character that if it were to be a law where he would have to choose between God and government, he would choose God every time over government. They don't know that, but they see that so clearly in everything else about him that they pin their hopes on him. And that's how faithful he was. And I made the point, I'm not going to make it again. I made it last time we were here. That needs to be said of us. That when people look at us, the first thing they see is not a really upstanding American citizen, but the first thing they see is a man or a woman faithful to the bitter end, devoted to God, even if it means completely betraying his country or her country, if it should so be. So that's what they see in Daniel. Verse 6. So these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and they came to him and they said, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents, verse 7, all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, that's all of these guys minus one. That's all of these guys minus one. That's Daniel right there, who all would stand to be lowered a peg, because they used to be here, and now if Daniel's elevated, they're going to be lowered. So this is their political future on the line, right? Nothing changes. Politicians have been evil from the beginning. All right. So all those people, they say to the king, all you presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, the captains, have all consulted together, and we've got the best idea. We want to establish a royal statute. We want you to sign, as the king, this decree, to make a firm decree that whoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, if he doesn't make it to you or in your name, O king, he should be cast into a den of lions. In other words, we want you just to sign this thing. We're going to have the month of Darius, is what we're going to call it. All right, we're workshopping the title, but that's what we're going with right now. We want to do this thing where if anybody wants to pray, if anyone wants to make a petition, they have to do it in the name of the king. They have to pray to you. They have to respect your authority as supreme over all else. You are the great giver and the great protector and the great all these things. And if they don't recognize you in that way, they specifically target prayer, then we're just going to cast them to a den of lions, which just seems like real big overkill, but that's their play because they want to get rid of Daniel. So they make the offer. They say, what do you say to that, king? Verse 8. Now, O king, establish this decree. Sign the writing, and sign it that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which alters not. The law of the Medes and Persians, this is where we left off. We have now caught up. The law of the Medes and Persians was this measure of enforcement. It was this idea that said, if the Persian ruled king, the Persian government, Medo-Persian government, if they sign a decree or sign a law according to this statute, there is no takebacks, there's no exceptions, there's no, holidays where you have a day off from having to obey the law. There's no, you have to obey it, but he doesn't, or you have to obey it, but I don't. If we sign it under the provision of the law of the Medes and Persians, that's it. There's no takebacks. And if it's broken, then you are broken. It's like you spit in the face of the emperor. And remember, all this started because he has been appointed by the emperor. So he is going to, spoiler, sign this decree here in just a second. And if it was a decree for anything, based on the principles of the law of the Medes and Persians, if even the king breaks it, you better believe, lickety-split, the emperor is going to cut off his head. Because the whole point of that provision is, you come into a territory, like in this case Babylon, and the Persians have conquered Babylon. They put them under their subjection. But not just Babylon, because Babylon had already conquered dozens of other kingdoms. There's all kinds of people under their authority, now under Persian authority. So there's this new government in power. The last thing you want, whenever there is an overturning of the political system, is what always happens, revolutions popping up left and right. You want to tamp that down immediately. So you go in there and you say, listen, we're going to take care of you. We're going to be there for you. Don't cross us. If you don't cross us, it's going to be great. It's going to be fine. We're all going to get along. And to show you that you can count on our fidelity, that you can trust our faithfulness, we have this thing here in Medo-Persia called the law of the Medes and Persians, where if we sign a decree under this, we can't break it, we can't change it. It's not a you law, not a me law. It's an everybody has to obey it kind of law. So you can trust that we're going to keep our word. It's a way of sowing confidence in this new government that happens to be their evil, oppressive overlords. And you don't want revolutions. The Romans had their own ways of doing this, and the Greeks and the Parthians and so forth. Well, this is the Medes and Persians way of doing it. So if any of these guys, up to and including the king himself, breaks this, you are sowing distrust in the whole empire system, and that can't be tolerated. So it is not done lightly. And yet, because the idea was Darius month, the vanity of the king takes over and he doesn't think clearly. He could have just said, sounds like a good idea, let's just rubber stamp it and not go to the trouble of making it the official decree, but they're playing to his vanity. So establish the decree according to the law of Medes and Persians. Verse 9. So King Darius signed the writing and the decree. And after that, he probably just went about his day and didn't give it a second's thought, because he's a pagan. He doesn't care if people worship him. He doesn't care if people pray to him. These things are not out of the ordinary. He's not the ultimate sole guy. If anybody's going to be worshipped in this empire, it would be, you'd think, the emperor. But he's, there's like hundreds of miles between these guys right now. So as far as he's concerned, this is fine. They can pray to me. It's not a big deal. What's the worst that can happen? Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew the writing was signed, presumably some decree would be given, some statement would be made, hear ye, that sort of thing. So when Daniel knew the writing was signed, what did he do? He went into his house, his windows being opened in his chamber bedroom toward Jerusalem, and he knelt on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God. Key phrase at the end of the verse, just as he always had done, or as he did aforetime, it says in the Old King James. So Daniel's idea, okay, I'm going to illustrate it for you with a very simple illustration. Before the decree was, really? Why do we even, missed it. That's okay. Why do we have that then? Before the decree was signed, Daniel was a praying man. Praying. The decree is signed. No praying. Which, it's not technically the law, but the law is don't pray to Jehovah. You must, if you're going to pray, pray to Darius. So basically, no praying the way you've been praying. The decree is signed. Daniel just skips on right by that and keeps on praying. In other words, nothing changes. This line here might as well not even be there. It doesn't matter. I've been doing it. I am doing it. I'm going to keep doing it. And the only thing that's going to stop me from doing it is if I die. So no matter what, I'm going to continue praying. And his custom that he had always been following was to go to his private chambers, his bedroom, where his window was pointed toward the west, toward Jerusalem. and he would face that way toward the holy city, toward the temple, which has now been destroyed by the Babylonians, but toward the peak of Mount Moriah, toward the place where the Ark of the Covenant once sat, toward the place where God's throne on earth, proverbial standpoint, was. He would point his eyes there, and he would utter his prayers, his morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. That's what he did before. They said, don't do that. That's what he's doing now. They said, don't do that. And if time permits, that's what he'll do tomorrow, after they have said not to do that. Nothing changes. Now, you think I'm stating the obvious here, but I'm making a point, which is when the law was made, Daniel did not say, we've got to have a town meeting. Daniel did not say, I've got to go to the street corner. Daniel did not say, we've got to protest. I need picket signs. I need wood. I need cardboard. I need marker. That's not what Daniel did. Daniel said, nothing changes. And if Daniel's custom had been, I'll pray once in the night, he would have continued praying once in the night. If Daniel's custom had been to go to the front lawn of his house and pray where he could be seen by his neighbors, if that was his custom, he would have gone to the lawn, to the front yard of his house to pray in front of his neighbors. In other words, he's not going to do more, and he's not going to do less. He's going to just do what he's always done, because Daniel serves God. Serving government is just something he does through the prism of serving God. And if government aligns with the laws of God, I'm going to follow the laws of God. And if government doesn't align with the laws of God, I'm going to keep following the laws of God. Nothing is going to change. Now, I say all that. It has become very in vogue today to make loud protestations, to make loud political statements, to make loud protests about whatever you don't agree with, even if the things you don't agree with are ungodly. And yet the example of Daniel is, were you not doing godly things before? If so, continue doing them. Nothing should change, assuming you've been faithful. So that's what Daniel's, modus operandi was. I'm going to keep doing what I've always done. Verse 11. And so upon doing that, the men who had been conspiring against him assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Now, where was he praying again? Not in the street corner, not out in public. He was in his bedroom facing his window. I doubt he was even shouting. Probably just doing his regular thing. So they had to go looking. That's obviously, you would think that's not out of character for these guys. They're trying to entrap him. But they had to go extra effort to find him. Again, he's not doing something. He's not flaunting. He's not tempting. He's not asking for it. He's just being himself. Verse 12. And I emphasize it's going to come into play when you hear Daniel's own words about why he's going to be rescued from the lion's den. Verse 12 now. So those conspirators come near and they speak before the king concerning the king's decree. They go to the king and they say, hey, didn't you sign a decree? And they look at each other, they're playing it up. Do you remember there was a decree that every man who asks a petition of any god or man, then they suddenly they're reciting it verbatim. Anyone who asks a petition of any man within 30 days, except of you, O king, should be cast into the den of lions. Do you remember that? I have this vague recollection of pulls out scroll. That if anybody does not serve the king according to 30 days, he has exactly memorized exactly, and then he unscrolls it. Do you remember when that was done, O king, that he had to be cast into a den of lions? And the king, who to this point does not suspect anything yet, that's going to change, he answers and says, yeah, the thing is true. According to the law of Medes and Persians, which alters not. Yes, I signed that decree, that if anybody offers a prayer to anybody but me, nobody gets an exception, you got to be thrown into the den of lions. Verse 13. So that they answered to the king, well, Daniel, who is of the children of the captivity of Judah, a simple reminder, he's not one of us. He doesn't pray to our gods. He doesn't respect our ways and customs. And now look, he doesn't regard you, O king, nor the decree that you have signed. But he makes his petitions 3 times a day. Do you see the way they took the truth and twisted it to look worse than it was? Because as we already noticed, Daniel was already praying 3 times a day before this law was passed. But they're coming to the king saying, we passed this law, and now he's praying 3 times a day. Now, if Daniel was a guy who prayed once a day, if that was just his custom, and suddenly he's praying 3 times a day, now they've got an argument. Now, Daniel has given them a bullet. He's given them ammunition against him. They can say to the king, he is openly, flagrantly defying you. He is going against your decree purposefully. But they can't do that without lying. And it's not a lie in terms of just speaking a flat-out untruth, It's a lie by just twisting the truth to make it seem like something that's worse than it is. He's now praying 3 times a day, as if he wasn't doing that last Tuesday too. He makes his petitions. He doesn't regard you, nor the decree you signed. Verse 14. So again, it's technically true, but the way it is spun might as well not be. Boy, you'd think this was today, because this kind of stuff happens today. Verse 14. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased. With Daniel? No, what does it say? Why? Why is he displeased with himself, Margaret?
He knew he shouldn't have signed it.
Because he's made a law that he's going to have to enforce now. He's thinking 3 days ahead. He's made a law he's about to enforce that's now going to negatively affect a guy that he had and still has such respect for. It's not about, oh, Daniel, how could you? That's the stark difference between chapter 3 and chapter 6. In chapter 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah refused to bow to the golden idol of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was furious. Now, he set up that idol. He didn't give it a second's thought. But once he made the command, he expected it to be obeyed, and they said, yeah, but we're not gonna, because we worship God. And so he was furious, and after it was built, then he makes all of his mistakes Nebuchadnezzar does. He doesn't back down, he doubles down, he gets enraged with a blind rage and throws him in the fire. Here, it's the opposite. Here the king does all the damage before the fact. He shouldn't have signed it in the first place. He should have thought before he acted. He should have considered his vanity and tempered it a little bit. But he signs it without giving it a second's thought, and now he starts to feel regret. Now he feels bad, but it's too late. Nebuchadnezzar could have said, never mind, don't throw them in the furnace. There's no law of the Babylons and the Babylons. This was a law of the Medes and Persians. New governments in town, new laws are enforced. And so he's thinking, I have made a huge mistake. Again, verse 14. The king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. Set his mind on, what am I going to do to get this guy out of this? And he labored on that idea till the going down of the sun for how to deliver him. He might have called in his law scholars. He might have called in his historians. Has there ever been anybody, guys, where there was a law passed and they got out of it? Give me something. Find me a loophole. Give me some way to prevent this innocent person from being killed. They've already told him he's disregarding your law. But now he has some perspective. Now he sees the consequences of his own stupid vanity, and he realizes the law wasn't that important. Is there some way we can forget this whole law? But these conspirators are so smart, they made sure it was a Mede and Persian decree. There's no takebacks. And look what happens in verse 15. The men, these guys, assemble to the king, and they say to the king, Know, K-N-O-W, understand, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, the King James says, but the idea is what it is. It is that no decree nor statute which the king establishes may be changed. They heard the evidence. He was up all night worried about it. He was up all night trying to figure out a way. We got to make sure that he holds to it. So they go to the king, and they are playing with fire, and they don't even realize it yet. And they are standing in gasoline, and they're holding matches, and it's about to be lit. And they go to the king, and they say, you've got to enforce this. And clearly he doesn't want to. He's still the king. So even if worst case scenario, which for Daniel is best case, he gets to go be with God. If worst case scenario, Daniel dies, you think the king is just going to elevate one of them? No, the jig is now up. He knows that they have played him like a fiddle. And so they are playing with fire, and they're going to get burned. No spoilers, but it's going to happen. They say to him, you got to enforce it. Verse 16. With no options, no possibilities. Verse 16 says, the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spoke and said to Daniel, quote, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. How does he know that? I mean, he doesn't. And in fact, neither does Daniel. I mean, if Daniel is anything like his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who decades earlier, when they stood before Nebuchadnezzar, and they were faced with the option, bow down to the idol now. I'll give you a second and third chance. And if you don't, then I will kill you. And they are faced with that moment, right? Daniel, from his perspective, was tricked. He was caught. He was just doing what he was always doing, and the law was passed, and they got him. The 3, they were given a second chance. They were given an out. And you know how hard it would be for people to have that opportunity and not to take it. for the king to say, you still have a chance to bow. Just pretend to bow. Bow down and tie your shoes for a second. Just fake it, and then you can go free. And they still didn't do it. They said in chapter 3, they said, if you want to throw us in there, fine. If God wants to rescue us, fine. If God wants to let us burn, fine. But there is no way we're bowing to that statue. There is no way we are betraying God. Because I can betray you and you can kill this body. And then God may let this body burn. And then God will save me in the end. Or I can betray God and lose my body and my soul. And they know two's better than one. And they think, I'd rather lose my body and keep my soul than lose both. So there is no way I'm bowing. But here, they didn't have, or Darius didn't have what Nebuchadnezzar had. Nebuchadnezzar had a previous engagement with Daniel in chapter 2. He had a previous conversation with the three, or just before he threw them in when they talked about their God. But Darius, as far as we could tell in the text, he doesn't have any of that. So as far, all I can tell is it's because of Daniel's such upstanding character and the way he lived that probably through the course of his deciding, let's rearrange and restructure the government to elevate Daniel, as he looked into why Daniel was so upstanding, he saw, here's a guy who is entirely faithful to his God. That clearly was Daniel's reputation, because that was the angle the conspirators took against him. Let's use his religion against him. So he was living his faithfulness in such a way that there was no doubt that he believed his God would deliver him. So this pagan, who doesn't exclusively worship Jehovah, or even inclusively worship Jehovah, is still willing to say, I hope your God, I have confidence that your God, as faithful as you have shown yourself to everything else, you have been that faithful to your God, I'm confident he'll deliver you. But my point is this. Here's a guy who was praying privately, but that doesn't mean he was praying in hiding. It's just his custom was private. Publicly, everybody knew who he worshiped. It doesn't have to be a black or white thing, a one or the other thing, where, oh, well, you've got to be loud and protesting all the time, or you're just a coward in your corner. Daniel was no coward, but he wasn't an obnoxious person either. Everyone knew he was faithful, and he privately did his religion as well. So, again, the king says, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Verse 17. And as they are prepared to bring him in, a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet. To seal it is not like to glue it, or to do something like wax it or something, to seal it like that. It's to put your royal seal on it. So you wear a ring, and you would have, some kind of a design on it. You'd have your ring, and you would press your ring onto the wax to put your symbol of the king, which that looks like a dude with a big nose, but whatever it is, that's your symbol. And so if anybody comes up to the stone intending to rescue Daniel, they would see the king himself has reminded us he's got to stay in here, as we'll see, for the whole night. Again, verse 17. Stone is brought, laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. In other words, the law is what it is. There's no take-backs. He's got to go in. No one can get him out. Now, the only reason he would have to do that, because the king is about to leave and go back home and stress over it all night. But that means the king was thinking, Daniel is so loved and so respected that some, merciful-minded Jew might try to rescue him. Some merciful-minded Babylon soldier or Babylon ethnicity soldier who's been around him for so many decades might try to rescue him. Some Persian might think the whole law is unfair and try to rescue him. Some guy who just wants to be Batman might try to break in there and rescue him because he's such a person of great character that they might try to save him. And I've got to make sure they remember the law is and cannot be changed. So once that's done, verse 18, Daniel's already in there. They've sealed him in. Verse 18, the king goes to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were the instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him, the King James says. He wasn't able to get any sleep that night. Typically, a guy in this position of power, if he can't sleep, he can call in people to play him a song. Remember David would play the harp for Saul, things like that. He would have food brought to him, but he's fasting the whole night. He doesn't want to relax. He doesn't want to sleep. He's going to stay up all night. I don't know. It doesn't say if he's praying to his gods, praying to Daniel's God, or just up, just stressing about it, thinking about it, whatever. Either way, he's not sleeping tonight. Next morning, verse 19. The king rose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. Under normal circumstances, Daniel would have been devoured and picked apart within just minutes to hour of his being put in there. Because these lion dens, the whole idea of them is they weren't throwing kibble down there in between the bodies. They were starving those lions. So they were ravenous whenever finally a prisoner would be lowered down to them. So mealtime for them was a dude. That was their food, okay? So you would put them in there, and if you've ever had a dog who has a bowl of half-eaten food, and then you have one treat, he cares nothing about it, he just is going to stare at that treat. And you can hold it there, and he will just focus on the treat. And even though there's all this food here that I'm not blocking him from, he's just going to stare. He'll finally say, go get it. Ah! And then he just pounces on it and just devours it. This one little thing that's gone in 3.5 seconds. But he's got 30 seconds worth of food right here. That ravenous, I just must have, is how these lions were. So they lowered Daniel in there, and they lowered him in, then put the stone there. Then he seals it. Then he probably says, nobody bother him. I'm going back to my house. It's got to be 5 minutes at least past by the time Daniel's lowered in there. But nobody is hearing ah, oh, ah, e. Nobody is hearing you're not hearing anything. That should have been red flag number 1. He goes back to his palace. He's stressed out. He gets up early in the morning and he runs to the den of lions as though he doesn't know what's about to come. Verse 20. Even though he said, God will deliver you. Well, he's not the only one to say it and then not believe it. We all do that. Verse 20. When he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. The king spake and said, Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God. Now look at his question. I'm going to read the King James, then I'm going to get some different translations from the crowd. Mine says, is your God, whom you serve continually, able to deliver you from the lions? Different translation from somebody, please.
Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?
All right, been able. Mine says just able to. Same idea. Anybody have anything different? All right. Do you see the question he's asking? Could God do it? Was God able to do it? The night. This is not the same thing. Let's pretend. Day, night. Oh, night, day. Now we're in the morning. Was God able over the night to rescue you? Because I blocked people from going in there. But was your God, whom you served for so long, able to save you? The question he should have been asking was, did God choose to rescue you from the consequences of my stupid vanity? That should have been the question. Was God willing to spare you the consequences of my mistake? But he doesn't put the burden on himself right now. He thinks like a pagan thought about their gods, which is their gods could do a lot of things, but couldn't do everything. And their gods would sometimes just arbitrarily choose not to do nice things. And sometimes they would arbitrarily choose to do mean things. I mean, the Greeks built a whole philosophy around if Zeus wakes up on the wrong side of the bed, thunderstorm, thunderstorm, thunderstorm. He's chucking lightning bolts at us. So that was the pagan idea of the gods. And that's this consistent, uniform idea of every little g God, except for capital G God Jehovah. Every other religion and every other kind of idea about every other God was always, can he? Does he want to? Is he able to? And they put the burden on God so that if they're not rescued, in this case, it's because God's fault. But really, the fact that he's in there at all is Darius' fault. It's his fault. But he doesn't put it on himself. He thinks, was God able? Could God do it? But as we've already seen from chapter 3, the Hebrew mindset, which is unique among all religions, the Hebrew's mindset to God, and now the Christian mindset, because it's the same God, is not can he, but will he choose to? What is his plan? Because I'm just a part of it. It's his. He's the shepherd. I'm just the sheep. And if he wants to let me die, I will live with him. And if he wants to let me live, I will live for him. And then eventually live with him when I die. So it's a completely different perspective of how to look at it. And it's not just these guys, which this is relatively modern concerning human history. You go back to Job. That's the earliest account of a person that we have from, a living in a society kind of perspective. We got Adam and Eve and Noah and things like that, but it's just, those are just quick little moments of things that happen, big picture stuff. In terms of just a guy living a normal life, Job is such an ancient account that gives you this idea of how people lived in the early Genesis days, like right after the flood. And Job already had that mentality of, I have lost all of this. I've lost my family, I've lost my health, I've lost my friends, I've lost everything. But God gives and God takes. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It's not God is bad, this is God's to do with as he pleases. And that was so foreign and remains. At the time of Job, there were other religions that had popped up. Paganism had already come into play. People were already worshiping trees and not the maker of the trees. And already even then, Job and his idea about God was so unique, which is he is the maker of everything, and we are just, under his purview. Whereas the pagans put themselves almost on an equal level with their gods. They're just stronger. Because he made me, but, he's just the God of the trees, and fire can destroy the God of the trees, things like that. And that uniqueness has stayed consistent. There's no other religion that treats God, their God, in that unique kind of way. So that's the mentality of Darius. Was he able? And then finally we get the answer. Verse 21. Daniel says to the king, O king, live forever. And as we've seen many times in this book, that's just your standard way of greeting the king. You always start by saying, oh, I hope your reign is long and prosperous. Now here's what I need. Well, the fact that Daniel, in the pit, with all these lions, starts in the most mundane way is so wonderful. He's like, king, it's fine. Live forever. Verse 22. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocence was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. There's a lot in this one little verse, but I want to make one point before I dive into that. We never saw, through the reading of the text, the angel rescue Daniel. And that's very rare in the Bible. You have, like, for example, Paul and Silas in prison, Acts chapter 16. You are given a first-person account. You're brought in there, not first, it's third person, but you're in the room with them when the earthquake happens and the shackles are broken and the doors are open and they could escape and flee and the jailer thinks he's going to lose all his prisoners, he's about to kill himself. You get to witness the whole thing happen. What you don't get is one verse, Paul and Silas were chucked in there. Next verse, the next morning, what happened? They're gone. You don't get that like you get it here. You have Peter in prison, and he's about to be beheaded. Then the angel has to, kick him and wake him up because he's so content, even though he's about to die. And has to wake him up and say, "Get out, we're not done yet." And has to force him out of the prison. You see that happen. You watch that happen. He goes to Rhoda's house. Remember the whole hilarious thing that happens? So you get to watch that happen. But here, you're left in suspense. You hear Daniel goes in, and we follow the king. We follow his narrative. We follow his storyline. And we get to see him stressing and fretting over it. And then he comes back and he calls out, Daniel, are you still in there? And if I've never read Daniel before, I could maybe guess. I got 150 pages of notes still to come. But I can maybe guess, but I don't know. Daniel, the writer, leaves me in suspense. Which, I guess he's the writer. That should be a clue. But anyway, the point is, we now get to see what happened. Verse 22. Here's what happened. God sent an angel. He doesn't tell you how, he just tells you what. He shut the mouths of the lions, so they have not hurt me. I don't know if that means, physically did not allow them to open their mouths, or if it's just like a poetic way of saying he did something so that they would not choose to devour him. Whatever it was, he was rescued. And he gives two in this verse, and he'll give a third in the next couple of verses about why he was rescued. So, if there was ever a question about the mindset of Daniel as this guy who prays and that was used against him, and how he responded to the law and how he didn't respond to the law, let the man himself, by divine inspiration, tell you why God chose to let him live. And he says for two things in this verse. One, I was innocent. Now, technically, he was guilty because the law was the law and he broke the law. He prayed to God and not to Darius. But God recognizes laws that don't interfere with him and his will. God does not recognize laws that do interfere with his will. And God's will was, Daniel, pray to me. When a law comes in that contradicts that will, God is not going to call you guilty for continuing to do what is faithful, what was faithful and what still is faithful, which is praying to God. So from God's perspective, he's innocent. The more interesting one is what he says next. Innocence was found in me, and also before you, O king, have I done no hurt. But wait, you did, Daniel, because you prayed to a God who wasn't you, and that was the law. So yeah, technically in a national, worldly sense, he broke the law. But did he hurt the king? Here's how he could have hurt the king. He could have said, oh, is there a law that I have to pray to the king now? Well, I'm going to pray even louder to my God. I'm going to thumb my nose at that law. I'm going to go to the street corners with my picket signs, and I'm going to yell and scream and make a fool of myself and put on all my Facebook statuses so people can give me all their internet points, because that's what it's all about, not praise from God, but praise from man. I'm going to do all those things so people can see how faithful I am in spite of the king's law. Look how great I am. Because that's exactly what a Christian is supposed to sound like, those words, or a man of God like Daniel was. So that's how he could have thumbed his nose at the king. And then he would have forced the king's hand. Then it would have been anger like Nebuchadnezzar, which that's a different circumstance because he forced it on them to make that choice right then. Here, this was an entrapment issue. But he didn't respond with this flagrant, obnoxious disobedience. That would have been a hurt to the king. He reacted with humility, with meekness, with quietness. He reacted much like our master reacted. And because of that, Daniel attributes his rescuing. So I think there's something to be said, if you want application, to how we respond when our government imposes things we don't like. And the Daniel perspective is, I'm going to respond by still doing what has always been faithful. Whether that interferes with the law or not, I'm going to keep being faithful, but I'm going to keep being faithful in the way I've always been faithful. I'm not going to suddenly turn into a loudmouth about it. I'm going to continue being who I always was, because that's genuine, that's true, that's meek, because that's our master was meek, and so was Daniel. 23. Then the king was exceeding glad for him, and commanded they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found on him, not a scratch or a bite mark to be found, because he believed in his God. That's your third explanation. Why was he spared? Because he was innocent toward God, because he was innocent toward the king, because he had faith that God would deliver him. Doesn't mean he thought he would be delivered. He just thought if God wanted, he knew God was able. Unlike the king questioning it, Daniel never questioned it. If God wants to get me out of here, I know God will get me out. Verse 24. And the king commanded, and they brought the men who had accused Daniel. Reckoning time. They brought the men that had accused Daniel and cast them into the den of lions. Now here's where it gets a little messy. Them and their children and their wives, and the lions had mastery of them, no one shutting their mouth, and broke all their bones in pieces, and to all who came into the bottom of the den. Now what did the wives of these conspirators do? What did the children of these conspirators do? Mind you, children could be anything from 30 to 3. I mean, it doesn't tell us. But what did they? Nothing. Presumably, let's give the benefit of the doubt, they were innocent. Innocent people were murdered. Why? Because an evil ruler, let's not give Darius too much credit. This whole thing's his fault in the first place. An evil ruler thought, these guys tried to trick me into killing my best servant. They are traitors, and you don't just kill a traitor, you kill a traitor's whole family. Because if you kill a traitor's father and you leave a traitor's son will grow up to become a traitor's father. You got to just prune the whole thing, prune the whole tree. So that's their, and that is not the Bible condoning that. This is just history. This is just what the dude did. And it has to be recorded so we can know. So let's not, Darius acknowledges God. He's about to do it again. But the man's no saint, okay? He was a vain, petty, self-centered person to sign the decree in the first place. And then he felt bad after it. And now he's going to completely obliterate his line because that's politics. That's also doesn't ever change. Verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth. We call that hyperbole because he's just a regional ruler, but let him have his moment. And he says, peace unto you, everybody, peace be multiplied. I make a decree, verse 26, that in every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. So he's saying, here was this decree that said, you got to pray to me. I'm going to turn it around and say, no, it should be to the God of Daniel. For that God is the living God, steadfast forever. He's resilient. He's always around forever. And his kingdom, that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. Oh, where did you hear that? Maybe when he was consulting his historians, or maybe he just read about it when he conquered and he wanted to read up on the history of Babylon. He read about Daniel, already knew about how great he was, so he wanted to promote him. Maybe he heard or read about, maybe he read writings of Daniel that had already been transcribed. from his meetings with the king in chapter 2 and in chapter 7, which we've already covered. Which this is not chronological, so 7 was before 6. So either way, he heard about Daniel and his speeches concerning the kingdom of the Messiah that should never be destroyed. And he mentions that here. Let everybody worship that God, because that God is the God who is greater than all. Well, it's all great and true, everything he says, not taking that away. But I mean, we've read Daniel so far all the way through. This is not the first time a king has been wowed by God and made a big show about how great Jehovah is. And how, oh, everybody should worship Jehovah. Let's all worship Jehovah, guys. And like 6 months later, Jehovah? Who? Which one's Jehovah? And they completely drop it because they're just pagans and they're fickle. Verse 27. About God, he says, he delivers and he rescues. Hey, that's what I wrote. He delivers and he rescues. And he works signs and wonders in heaven and in earth. And he has delivered Daniel to the power of the lions. I'm almost done. Any comments or questions from the class? We have about 2 minutes. I finished early. I'm sorry. That's Daniel chapter 6. That closes this circle. We've now finished this idea of God rescuing his people. The idea being, to tie in with the bullseye, God reigns in these kingdoms of men. He proves it, not just with his words and actions to the kings, but by reminding his own people that he will take care of you while you're in exile. You're there in this foreign land. You're far away from home. Everybody's worshiping their own gods, but I'm still in control, and I will take care of you if they get out of line. So we've closed that circle. We've closed this circle. We're now at the end of the book, which is chapters 9 through 12. So next week we're going to start chapter 10, because chapter 9 is chronologically the last chapter of Daniel. The whole thing's just a mess to piece together. But the order is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 10, 11, 11, 10. The thing is, 10 is like, all right, here's all the stuff that happened, and 11 takes place right here. But you can't just read 11 because it's in the middle, you know. You have to start here and then be like, hey, and then also remember chapter 11, and then there's chapter 12, and then chapter 9. So it's a mess and a half. But we'll start it next week. All right, that's all I have for you guys. Thanks you all very much.